He had lived in the neighborhood for only a few months, and for the first time in years, life finally felt quiet. After years of long hours, early mornings, and endless court cases, he wanted peace. The small house he bought sat near the end of a cul-de-sac, with tall fences and trees around the backyard. He liked that privacy. It gave him a place to breathe, to think, and to forget about the chaos that used to fill his days. Every morning, he'd sit on his small wooden deck with a cup of coffee, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves. He never bothered anyone. He waved politely to neighbors when they passed, kept his lawn neat, and made sure to follow all the community rules. He didn't know many people yet, but he liked it that way. The neighborhood had a homeowners association, something he didn't care much about at first. He had heard that the HOA managed common areas, handled landscaping rules, and made sure everyone's property stayed up to standard. That seemed fair enough. He'd worked with stricter systems in his job before, so he thought, how bad could it be? It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when he first noticed something strange. He was inside, fixing a light in the kitchen, when he heard a faint noise from the backyard, a light crunching sound like footsteps on gravel. At first he thought maybe it was a squirrel or a delivery person, but then he heard the sound again, slower this time, along with a voice, a woman's voice. He walked to the window and gently pulled the curtain aside. What he saw made him pause. A woman stood in the middle of his backyard holding a clipboard and her phone. She was taking pictures, not selfies, but photos of his fence, his deck, and even the small potted plants near the steps. She looked serious, muttering to herself, pointing at different spots like she was inspecting something. He didn't recognize her, but he'd seen her once or twice driving around. She had a sharp, bossy tone when she spoke to others, the kind of person who always looked like she was giving orders. He'd overheard another neighbor once mention her name in a tired voice, calling her the HOA vice president who takes things too far. At first he thought maybe she had the wrong address. Maybe she was supposed to check something for the HOA and got mixed up. But when he saw her walk right up to his deck and take a photo of it, he realized she wasn't confused. She was trespassing, without permission, without notice, and without reason. He took a deep breath. His instinct as a court officer was to act immediately, to step outside, identify the violation, and take control of the situation. But he reminded himself that this was his home, not work. He didn't need to make a scene. So instead, he grabbed his phone and quietly recorded through the window. It wasn't about revenge or drama. It was about having proof in case things went wrong later. The woman kept pacing, checking the corners of his yard, even crouching near his flower bed. She looked irritated, like she was looking for something to complain about. After a few minutes, he had enough. He opened the back door and walked outside, calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said politely. The woman turned around, surprised for a second, then straightened her shoulders. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked, as if he was the one interrupting her. "I think that's my question," he replied evenly. "Can I help you?" "You're in my backyard." She looked at him with a mix of confidence and annoyance. "I'm from the HOA," she said, holding up her clipboard. "I'm just doing a quick inspection. There have been reports of possible rule violations." He blinked, trying to keep his tone polite. "In my backyard? Without notice?" "Yes," she said, her chin slightly raised. "We have the right to check for compliance. I noticed your fence color looks darker than allowed, and that deck might not have proper approval." He looked around. His fence had been there long before he moved in. The deck was inspected and approved when he bought the house. She clearly didn't know that. "I see," he said slowly. "But you're aware this is private property, right? You can't just walk in without permission." She frowned like she couldn't believe he was questioning her. "Sir, I'm part of the association. I'm allowed to inspect when needed. If everyone followed the rules, we wouldn't have to do this." He stayed calm. "I understand that the HOA can request inspections, but entering without consent is still trespassing. Next time, please contact me first." Her face turned red, but she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll make a note of that," she said sharply. "But expect to hear from us soon. There are several things out of compliance here." She turned and walked toward the gate, snapping one last photo before leaving. He watched her go, still calm but slightly amused. He'd seen this kind of behavior many times before. People in small positions of power who let it go to their heads. At work, he dealt with far worse. But this was his personal space, and that made it different. When she left, he reviewed the short video he'd recorded. It was clear she was inside his property uninvited, taking photos. He saved the file in a folder on his computer, labeling it just in case. That night, while sitting on his couch, he thought about whether to report her. But part of him didn't want to start a war with the HOA so early. He decided to wait and see what she'd do next. A few days passed peacefully. He mowed the lawn, greeted a few neighbors, and went back to his quiet routine. But the calm didn't last. One afternoon, he came home from work and found a piece of paper taped to his front door. It had the HOA logo on top. The letter said there were multiple violations on his property: unapproved deck color, non-standard fence, and improper garden decorations. It warned that failure to fix these issues could result in fines. He sighed, reading the letter twice. It didn't make sense. The deck and fence were part of the original property plan, verified during purchase. He had all the official documents to prove it. He could already tell who was behind it. Still, he didn't react. He'd learned long ago that patience and preparation always win over anger. He gathered his property papers, the inspection records, and photos of everything. He placed them in a folder and kept it ready. That evening, while watering his plants, he noticed movement again. Through the corner of his eye, he saw someone walking past slowly. The same woman. She didn't come in this time, but she stopped at the fence, standing on her tiptoes, trying to look over. When she saw him notice, she quickly pretended to be checking her phone and walked off. He shook his head slightly. It was almost unbelievable how far some people would go just to feel in control. Later, he talked briefly to one of his neighbors, an older man who had lived there for years. When he mentioned the situation, the neighbor sighed. "Yeah, she's done that before," he said quietly. "She acts like she owns the neighborhood. Most folks just let her be because they don't want trouble." He nodded, understanding more now. She wasn't just strict, she was used to people being afraid of her. But he wasn't like most people. His job had taught him to deal with confrontations the right way, calmly, legally, and with evidence. He didn't need to argue or threaten. He just needed to wait for the right time. That night, as he sat in his backyard under the dim porch light, he couldn't help but smile a little. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Not because he was someone important, but because he knew exactly how the law worked. And he also knew how to stay calm when others tried to provoke him. He decided then that if she stepped into his yard again, he'd document it properly, not to humiliate her, but to protect himself. He didn't want conflict, but he wouldn't let anyone walk over him either. The next weekend, he spent the morning cleaning the deck and repainting the small wooden railing. He wasn't doing it to please her or the HOA. He simply liked things neat. As he worked, he noticed her car drive by slowly, like she was checking up again. He didn't look up. He just kept painting, pretending not to notice. Inside, though, he could feel that the situation wasn't over. People like her rarely stopped after the first warning. They pushed further until someone stopped them. When the sun started setting, he sat back on the deck steps, wiping his hands. The air smelled of fresh paint and summer grass. He took a deep breath and thought to himself, "Peace doesn't come free. You have to defend it sometimes, quietly but firmly." He didn't know it yet, but that single trespassing incident was only the beginning. The HOA lady would soon push things further, and when she did, she'd find herself facing someone who knew exactly how the law worked, someone who wouldn't just let it slide. For now, he just enjoyed the silence of the evening, unaware of how interesting the next chapter of his peaceful life was about to become. The morning was calm, but there was something uneasy in the air. He could feel it the moment he stepped outside. The grass glistened from the night's rain, the air smelled fresh, and birds chirped in the distance. It should have been a peaceful start to the day, but the memory of that woman trespassing still lingered in the back of his mind. He tried to shake it off. After all, maybe she'd realized she was wrong. Maybe that letter on his door was the end of it. But part of him knew it wasn't over. People who thrive on control rarely stop after one encounter. They come back, and usually they come back louder. He made himself some coffee, sat on the deck, and looked around the yard. Everything looked clean and organized. The fence, the plants, even the deck he'd just painted. He couldn't see a single thing that could be considered a violation. The idea that someone would try to inspect it without permission still bothered him, but he had decided to stay patient. By late afternoon, he heard a knock on the door. When he opened it, there she was again. The same woman, clipboard in hand, expression stiff as a board. "Good afternoon," she said with that overly polite tone that hides irritation underneath. "I'm here to follow up on the notice we left. You were supposed to respond within 5 business days." He looked at her calmly. The notice didn't ask for a response. It just listed some so-called violations that don't exist. She frowned. "Are you saying you're refusing to comply?" "I'm saying," he replied, "that before anyone talks about compliance, you should first confirm your information is correct. My fence, my deck, and my garden were all approved by the county before I moved in. You can check your records." She gave a short, sharp laugh. "Our HOA doesn't rely on county records. We have our own guidelines, and your property doesn't match them." He nodded slowly, keeping his voice level. "That may be, but your guidelines still don't give you the right to walk into someone's backyard without permission." Her expression changed. For a brief moment, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not guilt, but annoyance. She wasn't used to people standing their ground. "I was simply doing my job," she said quickly. "It's part of my duties as the HOA vice president. Maybe next time you should read the rule book more carefully before accusing people." He could tell she was trying to provoke him, but he wasn't the kind of person to take the bait. "I'm not accusing anyone," he said calmly. "I'm just reminding you that everyone, even the HOA, must follow the law, including trespass laws." Her mouth tightened. She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped back and said, "We'll see what the board decides then." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. When she was gone, he quietly closed the door and took a deep breath. He'd seen that kind of behavior before, people who didn't like being told no. It was a strange mix of pride and insecurity that made them believe they always had to win. The next day, he went about his usual routine, but now whenever he went outside, he noticed small things that made him think she hadn't given up. A car slowing down near his driveway, a shadow by the fence line. Once he even found a fresh footprint in the soft dirt near the back gate. He wasn't paranoid, he was observant. Years of being a court officer had taught him to notice patterns. He decided to prepare. He installed a small motion sensor camera near his back fence, the kind that automatically recorded short clips whenever someone came close. It wasn't about spying, and it was about protection. He didn't want to involve anyone unless he had to, but he also didn't want to be caught off guard. 2 days later, the camera proved useful. It was mid-morning when he got a notification on his phone. The motion sensor had triggered. When he checked the footage, he couldn't help but shake his head. There she was again, the same woman walking along the back fence holding her phone and peering into his yard. She wasn't inside this time, but she was leaning close enough to touch the fence with her hand. She appeared to be taking photos again. He saved the video quietly. No anger, no frustration, just patience. Later that evening, he got another letter. This time it was more aggressive. It claimed that his deck violated HOA color standards and that he had 7 days to repaint it or face fines. It even listed an amount. He read it twice, then set it down on the table. He knew what was happening now. This wasn't about his deck or his fence. This was about control, about someone trying to remind him who had authority in the neighborhood. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. The next morning, he went to the HOA office. It was a small building next to the community pool. Inside, the walls were covered with pictures of past events and smiling residents. A volunteer at the desk looked up and greeted him kindly. "I'd like to speak with whoever handles violation notices," he said calmly. The volunteer pointed toward a side room. That would be the vice president. "She's right in there," he smiled faintly. Of course she was. He walked in. She was sitting behind a table, flipping through papers. When she saw him, her eyebrows lifted. "Oh, you again," she said. "I didn't expect you to come in so soon." "I thought it would be faster to handle this in person," he replied. "I brought documentation." He placed a folder on the table. Inside were the original county-approved plans, inspection records, and the property's compliance documents, all official and dated. She glanced at them but didn't reach out. "These don't matter," she said dismissively. "The HOA has its own rules." He looked straight at her. "Maybe so. But those rules still have to stay within the law. And the law says you can't trespass and you can't issue fines without proof of a violation." Her smile vanished. "Are you threatening me?" "Not at all," he said calmly. "I'm simply explaining. I prefer to solve things peacefully, but if we're going to discuss compliance, it should go both ways." For a moment, she didn't speak. Her face tightened, her fingers tapping the clipboard. She was used to people backing down, but he wasn't like the others. He didn't raise his voice, didn't insult her. Just facts and calm confidence. That unsettled her even more. Finally, she said, "Fine. I'll bring it up in the next board meeting." "Good," he said with a nod. "I'll be there." When he walked out, the volunteer at the front desk smiled at him softly. "Don't let it bother you," she whispered. "She's been like that for years. Maybe it's time someone stood up to her." He smiled back. "I don't want to fight," he said quietly. "I just want fairness." Back at home, he sent an email to the HOA board, attaching scanned copies of all his documents and politely explaining what had happened, including the unauthorized inspection. He didn't accuse or insult anyone. He just told the truth. Over the next few days, things got tense. She didn't show up near his house, but he could tell she wasn't happy. Her car still passed by often, and once he caught a glimpse of her glaring his way while walking her dog. He didn't mind. He knew people like her always reacted that way when they lost control. Then one evening, something happened that confirmed everything he suspected. He was reading on the couch when the motion camera pinged again. He opened the app and froze for a moment. There she was, this time inside the yard again, holding a measuring tape and pacing around. It was clear as day. Trespassing again. He walked quietly to the window, watching her. She looked annoyed, muttering under her breath as she measured the deck railing. He waited until she was near the back gate before stepping outside. "Evening," he said in his usual calm voice. She jumped, startled. Her measuring tape dropped to the ground. I was just checking something," she stammered. "Without permission again?" he asked, folding his arms. "That's twice now," she hesitated. "I'm doing my job. If you would just follow the HOA guidelines, I wouldn't have to do this." He shook his head slowly. "You're not doing your job. You're breaking the law." Her face flushed with anger. "You can't talk to me like that." "I'll report you." He didn't move. "You're welcome to report me. I have recordings of every visit, including this one. I'll be reporting this incident too, formally." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked at him for a moment, then turned and stormed out the gate. He let out a long breath, not from fear or anger, but relief. He'd stayed calm, and he had the evidence. That night, as he watched the footage again, he couldn't help but think about how strange people could be. How a person could convince themselves they had power over others when they really didn't. He knew what would come next. A heated board meeting, more letters, maybe even a confrontation in front of others. But he wasn't worried. He had the truth, the law, and patience, and that was more than enough. Outside, the night was quiet again. The garden lights glowed softly and the air was cool. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "You can't scare someone who lives by the rules you don't understand." The real showdown was coming soon, and deep down, he was ready for it. The week after that last encounter felt different. The air around the neighborhood carried a strange tension. Every time he stepped outside, he could feel the weight of silent eyes watching from behind curtains. It wasn't paranoia. It was the kind of quiet you get when people know something's going on but don't want to get involved. He didn't mind. He had dealt with worse before. Tense courtrooms, angry defendants, and difficult witnesses. Compared to those, a nosy neighbor was just background noise. Still, it was disappointing. He had moved there for peace, not conflict. One morning, as he sat on his deck with a cup of coffee, he saw her again. She wasn't in his yard this time, but across the street, talking to two other neighbors. Her hands moved a lot when she spoke, and every now and then, the neighbors would glance his way. He couldn't hear what she was saying, but he could guess. It was clear she was trying to turn people against him. He smiled quietly. So that's her next move, he said to himself. She wasn't just trying to control him through rules anymore. She wanted to isolate him socially. But that wasn't going to work either. He didn't depend on gossip or opinions to live his life. He believed that time and truth had a way of showing who people really were. Later that afternoon, he received another letter. This one came directly from the HOA board. It was longer, filled with formal language about community standards, possible fines, and requests for immediate correction. The same issues were listed again: fence color, deck color, and something new: unsightly clutter. He looked around his yard. There was nothing but a few flower pots, a small table, and a chair. It was almost laughable. He sighed, set the letter down, and decided it was time to handle things differently. Waiting patiently hadn't stopped her. It was time to take a step forward, calmly, professionally, but firmly. That evening, he drafted a short email to the entire HOA board. It was polite and well-written, with no hint of anger. He attached clear photos of his property, his official documents, and the 2 video clips of her trespassing. In the email, he explained the situation factually, that the same board member had entered his property without notice, that the violations were baseless, and that further harassment could result in a formal complaint. He didn't threaten. He just stated the facts and his rights. He ended the email with a simple line. I believe we can resolve this respectfully if fairness and privacy are valued equally within this community. He hit send, leaned back, and felt a strange calm. Whatever happened next, he knew he had done the right thing. 2 days later, he received a reply, not from her, but from the HOA president. The message was short and careful. We received your email and the supporting materials. The board will review this matter at our next meeting. You are welcome to attend to discuss your concerns. He smiled. That was exactly what he wanted. A fair platform. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in the small clubhouse near the neighborhood park. When the day came, he dressed simply. Nothing fancy, but professional enough to show he meant business. As he walked there, a few neighbors nodded politely. Some smiled. Others looked away. It didn't bother him. He had learned that silence often meant quiet support. Inside the clubhouse, about 15 people sat in folding chairs. The HOA president, a calm older man, sat at the head of the table. She, the same woman who had trespassed twice, sat beside him, her arms crossed tightly, looking annoyed that he had even shown up. The meeting began with regular announcements, budget updates, landscaping schedules, minor maintenance. Then the president looked up and said, Next, we'll discuss a concern raised by one of our residents regarding recent violation notices. He nodded when his name was called and stood up. The room quieted as he walked to the front. Thank you, he began in a calm tone. I just want to clarify a few misunderstandings regarding my property and the recent actions that were taken. He handed a folder of papers to the president and continued. I've provided proof that my fence, deck, and backyard were all approved by both county and HOA standards at the time of purchase. Nothing has been changed or modified since then. A few board members flipped through the documents, nodding quietly. He continued, However, my concern isn't just about the false violations. It's about how these inspections were conducted. On 2 occasions, a member of this board entered my backyard without permission, taking photos and measurements. I have both incidents recorded. A few gasps echoed around the room. The woman shifted uncomfortably, her face tight. The president looked at her. Is this true? She lifted her chin. I was performing my duties. We're allowed to inspect if there's a suspected violation. He spoke before the president could reply. With respect, sir, that's not accurate. HOA rules may allow property checks from public areas or with notice, but entering someone's private property without permission is trespassing. The law is very clear about that. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His calm, factual tone carried more weight than shouting ever could. The room was silent for a moment. Finally, one of the other board members spoke. He's right. We can't go into private property without consent. It's against our own bylaws. The woman's face flushed. I was only doing what's necessary to keep the community up to standard. He looked at her gently. And that's fine. We all want the neighborhood to look good. But there's a difference between caring for the community and violating someone's rights. The president cleared his throat. We'll review the evidence, he nodded. Of course. I just wanted to make sure everyone had the full picture. I've worked in law enforcement for many years. I understand how these situations can get complicated. But respect for privacy and for rules has to go both ways. That last line made several people nod quietly. The president thanked him for bringing the issue up, promising a fair review. The woman didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting, though her eyes never left him. He didn't look back at her. He had said what needed to be said. After the meeting ended, a few neighbors approached him outside. One woman smiled softly and said, You handled that well. She's been bossing everyone around for years. Another man added, We needed someone to finally stand up to her. Most of us were too scared to speak up. He thanked them but kept his tone humble. "I just wanted things to be fair," he said. "I'm not here to fight anyone." That night, as he walked home, he felt something he hadn't felt since the whole ordeal began. Relief. Not because it was over yet, but because the truth was finally out in the open. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that easy. People like her didn't let go of control easily. She would likely try something else, maybe behind the scenes. And he was right. A few days later, he found another letter in his mailbox. This time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was a handwritten note. The handwriting was sharp, almost angry. "You think you can embarrass me in front of everyone? You'll regret making this harder than it needed to be." He read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in an envelope. He didn't feel fear, just disappointment. He had given her every chance to act reasonably, but she had chosen hostility instead. That evening, he installed another camera near the front of his house, angled toward the mailbox and driveway. If she wanted to play games, she'd be recorded doing it, but he didn't stop there. The next morning, he visited the local police station. He knew most of the officers there. Some were old colleagues from his early days on the job. He spoke to a sergeant he trusted, explaining everything calmly. The sergeant listened carefully, then said, "You've handled this perfectly. Document everything. Don't confront her again. If she crosses the line one more time, we'll handle it." He nodded. That's all I needed. Over the next few days, he kept his distance. He focused on work, on his yard, on quiet evenings. The neighborhood felt slightly different now, quieter in a good way. People waved more often. Some even stopped to chat briefly. It was like everyone was relieved that someone had finally put boundaries in place. But the woman wasn't done. One evening, his phone buzzed with another alert from his security camera. He opened the app and there she was again. Not in his yard, but right outside the gate, taking pictures, pacing back and forth. She looked upset, muttering to herself. He didn't go outside this time. He just watched silently, letting the camera record everything. She eventually left after a few minutes. He downloaded the clip, saved it, and made a note. The next day, he sent another email to the HOA president, short and polite. "For your awareness, one of your board members continues to monitor my property directly. Please remind her that further harassment will be handled through the appropriate legal channels." He didn't get a reply that day, but he didn't need one. He had already said what mattered. As the sun set that evening, he sat quietly on his deck, watching the last bit of daylight fade behind the fence. He thought about how strange the situation had become, all because one person refused to respect boundaries. But at the same time, he felt proud. He had stayed calm, kept his dignity, and never once lowered himself to her level. He sipped his coffee and whispered to himself, "The law doesn't need shouting. It just needs proof." And he had plenty of that now. What he didn't know was that the next HOA meeting would change everything, and that soon, everyone in the neighborhood would finally see who had really been crossing the line. The next few days passed quietly, but it didn't feel peaceful. The man could sense the tension every time he walked outside. It was like the air in the neighborhood had turned heavier. Some neighbors smiled at him but quickly looked away, as if afraid someone might see them being friendly. He knew why. Word had spread that the HOA meeting was coming up, and the woman who had been harassing him was planning to bring up a long list of supposed violations. He had been patient long enough. He had gathered every bit of evidence, the video recordings, the documents showing his property's approval, and even the HOA bylaws that clearly said no one could enter a resident's yard without permission. He didn't like confrontations, but he believed in fairness. And if fairness required him to speak up, he was ready. On the evening of the meeting, he dressed neatly and arrived early. The small community hall was already half full. Folding chairs were arranged in rows and a long table sat at the front where the HOA board members were gathering. The woman was already there, sitting proudly at the center with a thick folder in front of her. She looked at him briefly, then turned away, whispering something to the person next to her. He quietly took a seat near the middle, observing. The atmosphere was strange. Some neighbors looked nervous, others curious. A few avoided eye contact altogether. He could tell that not everyone agreed with the woman's behavior. But she was the kind of person who spoke so loudly and confidently that few dared to question her. When the meeting started, the HOA president went over the usual agenda: maintenance updates, neighborhood safety reminders, and upcoming community events. The man listened quietly, waiting for what he knew was coming. Then finally, the woman raised her hand. "I have an issue to address," she said in a firm voice. "It concerns one of our residents who has repeatedly violated HOA rules." The room went silent. She looked straight at him as she spoke, her tone confident, almost smug. She opened her folder and began listing complaints about his fence, the deck, the color of his shed, and even the type of flowers planted in his yard. Each claim sounded exaggerated or completely false. He stayed calm, his expression neutral, letting her talk. She seemed to enjoy having everyone's attention. She flipped through photos she had taken, holding them up for the board to see, as if she were showing evidence of a serious crime. When she finally finished, she leaned back, crossed her arms, and said, "I believe these violations lower the value of our neighborhood. As the vice president of the HOA, I had to inspect the property myself, since he refused to cooperate." That last part made him raise an eyebrow. The president looked uncomfortable and asked, "You entered his property without permission?" The woman hesitated. "Well, I had to check for accuracy. It's part of my duty." The man took a deep breath. It was time. He stood up slowly, and the room turned toward him. His voice was calm, steady, and clear. "May I respond?" The president nodded. He walked closer to the table, carrying a small folder of his own. "I've been patient for weeks," he began, "and I tried to handle things privately. But since this matter has been brought up publicly, I think everyone deserves to hear the truth." He placed a printed document on the table. "First, here is my property approval file from the city's housing department. Everything from the deck to the fence color was approved before I even moved in. You can verify it with the county records." He pulled out another paper. "Second, the HOA's own rules, Section 5.2, clearly states that no member or board representative may enter a homeowner's yard without written consent. This rule exists to protect privacy and safety. Yet I have video recordings of someone, specifically the vice president, entering my property multiple times without notice or permission." The room filled with murmurs. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. He continued, "I didn't want to escalate this, but I have those recordings with timestamps, along with footage from my door camera showing her taking photos and leaving notes. I also have a copy of the police report I filed after one of those incidents, just to make sure everything stayed documented." The president looked surprised. "You filed a report?" He nodded. "Yes, not because I wanted to cause trouble, but because I wanted to do everything legally and respectfully. I work in law enforcement. Specifically, I'm a court officer. My job involves enforcing property laws and handling cases of trespassing. So believe me when I say I understand the difference between community oversight and unlawful entry." The room fell completely silent. Even the woman who had been so confident a few minutes earlier looked stunned. He continued, still in a calm voice, "I moved into this neighborhood for peace and privacy. I take care of my home, I follow the rules, and I respect everyone's space. But respect goes both ways. I shouldn't have to feel watched or invaded in my own yard." He turned to the neighbors seated in the back. "I know some of you have experienced similar situations. I've heard the stories quietly, and I understand that sometimes people don't speak up because they don't want conflict. But this kind of behavior, invading someone's space, making false reports, shouldn't happen to anyone." The HOA president finally spoke, his voice serious. "Can we see the recordings?" The man nodded and handed over a small USB drive. "They're all dated and clear. You can review them in private, but I think the point is already clear." The woman tried to interrupt, her voice shaky. "I was just doing my job. The neighborhood has rules." He looked at her, not angry but disappointed. "No rule gives anyone the right to violate another person's privacy. If you had concerns, you could have sent a letter or requested a proper inspection. Instead, you came into my property without permission." More than once, the room murmured again. One older neighbor in the back said softly, "He's right. She's done this before." Another added, "She's always taking pictures of everyone's house. It's about time someone said something." The president raised his hand for quiet. "I think we've heard enough for now. We'll review the documents and discuss this privately as a board." The man nodded politely and took his seat. He could feel the shift in the room. The energy had changed. The woman's earlier confidence was gone, replaced with visible frustration and embarrassment. As the meeting continued with other topics, he could sense people glancing his way, some smiling faintly, others giving quiet nods of support. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this anymore. When the meeting ended, a few neighbors approached him as everyone packed up. One couple thanked him quietly. Another man said, "We've been dealing with her nonsense for years, but nobody wanted to take her on. You handled that perfectly." He smiled modestly. "I just wanted fairness. That's all." On his way out, the woman tried to catch up with him. "You didn't have to humiliate me like that," she said in a tense voice. He stopped, turned slightly and said, "I didn't humiliate you. I simply told the truth. There's a difference." Then he walked away. That night, when he got home, he sat on his back deck with a cup of tea. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, he could relax. He could hear the faint sound of crickets, and the breeze carried the smell of the flowers he had planted months ago. He thought about how strange people could be sometimes, how a person could let a bit of power make them forget about kindness and respect. But he also thought about how standing up calmly, without yelling or anger, could make a stronger impact than any argument. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a message from one of the board members. It simply said, "Thank you for your patience and professionalism last night. We'll make sure this is handled properly." He smiled slightly and put his phone away. He didn't need revenge or drama. All he wanted was peace, and it finally felt within reach. As days passed, things around the neighborhood started to feel different. The woman didn't walk by his yard anymore. The notes stopped appearing. Even her constant presence around the block faded. The neighbors seemed more comfortable, chatting casually again. For him, it was never about winning. It was about setting things right. He had seen too many disputes in his career, where people let pride or anger ruin simple solutions. This time he was glad he had taken a calm, thoughtful path. In his heart, he hoped the woman learned something too. Maybe she realized that power wasn't about control. It was about responsibility. Maybe she'd think twice before crossing someone's line again. As the sun set that evening, he looked around his backyard and smiled. It was just an ordinary space, some flowers, a deck, a small shed, but it was his. It represented the peace he had earned after years of hard work. And now, finally, it was safe again. He sat back listening to the quiet. Sometimes justice didn't come through loud fights or big battles. Sometimes it came through patience, truth, and the courage to stand up calmly when it mattered most. A few weeks passed since the meeting, and life around the neighborhood slowly went back to normal. The man noticed the difference right away. The tension that once hung in the air was gone. People who used to rush into their homes now stopped to chat near their mailboxes. Kids played outside again. It felt like the neighborhood could finally breathe. He hadn't seen the woman since that night. She used to walk past his house every other evening, pretending to inspect lawns or pick up imaginary trash from the sidewalks. Now she was nowhere to be seen. Her absence didn't bother him. In fact, it brought a quiet kind of peace he had been missing for months. One morning, as he watered the plants in his backyard, he heard a faint knock on the fence. He turned and saw a man from 2 houses down, holding a mug of coffee. "Mind if I come in?" the man asked politely. "Sure," he replied, opening the gate. The neighbor smiled and said, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did at that meeting. You handled it better than anyone could have. Most people would have lost their temper, but you stayed calm. She needed to be put in her place." He chuckled softly. "I didn't want to embarrass her. I just wanted the truth to come out." The neighbor nodded. "Still, you gave everyone courage. She's been bullying people for years." The board finally talked about replacing her. They said they're reviewing everything she's done during her time as vice president. That made him pause. "Really?" "Yeah," the man said, sipping his coffee. "Turns out she's been bending rules and acting on her own a lot. She even fined a few families for things that weren't real violations. People were just too scared to fight back." He shook his head slowly. "That's the problem with people who get a little power. They start thinking it gives them control over others." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the sound of birds chirping nearby. The neighbor smiled again and said, "Anyway, we appreciate what you did. You made this place better for all of us." After he left, the man felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude from others for simply doing the right thing. It reminded him of why he chose his career in the first place. He believed in fairness, in protecting people, and in standing up when something wasn't right. Later that week, he received a letter from the HOA. When he saw the envelope in his mailbox, he hesitated for a second. After all the trouble he'd had with them, he didn't expect anything good. But when he opened it, the tone was completely different this time. The letter began with an apology. The board acknowledged the inappropriate actions of their former vice president and stated that she had been removed from her position. They assured him that new policies were being put in place to prevent similar incidents in the future, including strict limits on property inspections and mandatory member consent for any visits. At the end of the letter, they thanked him for his professionalism and patience, saying his calm approach had helped them make better decisions for the entire community. He folded the letter slowly, smiling to himself. It wasn't about being right, it was about restoring balance. Days later, he saw the woman again for the first time since the meeting. She was walking down the street with her head lowered, avoiding eye contact with everyone. When she saw him, she froze for a moment, then gave a small nod before continuing on her way. There was no anger in her face, just quiet embarrassment. He didn't hold a grudge. People made mistakes. Some just needed a hard lesson to realize it. He hoped she learned from it. That evening, he sat outside on his deck with a warm drink. The sun was setting, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. His yard looked peaceful again, untouched and private, just the way he liked it. As he looked around, memories of the past few months played in his mind. The first time she trespassed, the endless arguments, the frustration, the meeting. It had all felt like such a storm at the time. But now, sitting there in silence, it felt like that storm had finally passed. Sometimes he wondered why people felt the need to control others. He had seen that same behavior in court cases. Neighbors turning against neighbors, families fighting over fences or driveways. Most of it came down to pride. But pride never won. It just made life harder for everyone. He believed in something simpler: respect. Respect for boundaries, respect for privacy, respect for peace. If everyone followed that, there wouldn't be so many conflicts in the first place. A week later, the HOA held another meeting. This one was different. It felt friendlier, lighter. The new vice president, a quiet man who seemed genuinely kind, opened the session by addressing the changes they had made. They officially announced the new privacy policy and thanked the residents for their patience during the transition. When they mentioned his name, several neighbors clapped. He felt a bit embarrassed by the attention but smiled and nodded in appreciation. After the meeting, a few families came up to him. One woman said her husband had been fined unfairly the previous year, and they never fought it because they didn't want trouble. Another said she had almost moved out because of the constant pressure. They all thanked him for standing up, not just for himself but for everyone else too. He went home that night feeling lighter than ever. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about doing what needed to be done. A few days later, something unexpected happened. There was a knock at his door in the late afternoon. When he opened it, the woman stood there holding a small envelope. "I came to say something," she said quietly, her tone nothing like before. "I know you don't owe me anything, but I wanted to apologize. I got carried away. I thought I was helping the neighborhood, but I see now that I went too far." He looked at her for a moment, reading the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that," he replied gently. "It takes courage to admit a mistake." She nodded and handed him the envelope. "This is just a note to formally apologize. I already sent one to the HOA, too. I'm sorry for trespassing and for the way I treated you." He accepted it without hesitation. "It's okay. What's done is done. Let's just move forward." She smiled faintly, relieved, and walked away. When he went back inside and read her letter, it was short but genuine. She admitted her behavior had been wrong and said she had learned a lesson about respecting others' space. She even mentioned that she had started stepping back from HOA duties altogether to focus on her family and her own peace of mind. He placed the note in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder that even difficult people could change. In the weeks that followed, life was peaceful again. The neighbors started hosting small get-togethers. The laughter of children filled the air. The whole street seemed happier, freer, and more united than before. It was amazing how removing one source of negativity could change everything. One Saturday morning, as he was trimming his hedges, he noticed the new vice president walking by. The man waved and stopped to chat. "We're planning a community picnic next month," he said with a smile. "You should come. Everyone's contributing something." He smiled back. "Sure, I'll be there." When the day of the picnic came, the whole neighborhood gathered at the park. Tables were covered with homemade food, and people who used to barely talk now laughed together like old friends. He helped set up chairs and even grilled a few burgers for the kids. It was simple, but it felt special. This was what a community was supposed to be. People living side by side with respect, not fear. As the sun began to set, one of the older neighbors raised a toast. "To peace, to good neighbors, and to learning from our mistakes," she said. Everyone clapped and laughed, raising their cups. He looked around, taking it all in, the smiles, the laughter, the easy warmth of people finally at ease with each other. It was the kind of moment that made all the trouble worth it. Later that night, as he walked home, he passed by the woman's house. Her lights were off, but her garden looked well kept. Maybe she was finding her own kind of peace too. He reached his house and stood by the fence looking at the stars. He thought about how life had a funny way of teaching lessons. Sometimes all it took was one person standing up quietly for what was right to change everything around them. He sat on his deck again, feeling the calm breeze and listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood. Dogs barking softly, someone laughing in the distance, wind rustling through the trees. It was peaceful, exactly how he wanted it. He smiled to himself, thinking, maybe this is what real justice looks like. Not punishment, but balance. And with that thought, he leaned back, letting the calm night surround him. The chapter was closed, and peace had finally returned, not just to his home, but to the hearts of everyone around him.